Thanks, everyone. Welcome. My name's Catherine James and I'm from the Melbourne Law School, and it's great that you can all be here tonight to talk about my two favourite topics of tax and justice with our with our distinguished speaker, Professor Joe Stiglitz. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge and express my solidarity with their ongoing struggles for justice and those of First Peoples more broadly, including within this institution. I'll just provide a quick overview of tonight's proceedings. Shortly, I'll invite Professor Jenny George up, who's the Dean of the Melbourne Business School and Co-Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics, to introduce our guest, Professor Stiglitz. I'll then sit down with Professor Stiglitz for about an hour to have a chat about tax, justice and the good society. And we will finish with some questions from you, some of which will be put to Joe by my colleague, Miranda Stewart, Professor Miranda Stewart from the Melbourne Law School. And you can submit them at any time. I'm told that you can scan that app and you can submit a question and Miranda will receive them and put a few through to Professor Stiglitz. Professor Alison Duxbury, Interim Dean of the Melbourne Law School, will close proceedings at 8 o'clock. So I'll now hand over to Professor Jenny George to introduce Professor Stiglitz. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. It's my great pleasure to join in welcoming each of you here to this discussion of tax, justice and the good society. The Melbourne Social Equity Institute, the Taxation Law and Policy Program of the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law at the Melbourne Law School, and the Faculty of Business and Economics have all joined forces to bring this event to us tonight. And on their behalf and the University of Melbourne as a whole, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz is an economist and a professor at Columbia University Business School. He's also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD, and he is chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. Professor Stiglitz was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001, the John Bates Clark Medal in 1979, and he received the Sydney Peace Prize in 2018. This last prize was awarded to Professor Stiglitz for leading a global conversation about the crisis caused by economic inequality and exposing the violence inflicted by market fundamentalism. He's a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and a former chair of the US Council of Economic Advisors. So an underachiever. Known for his pioneering work on asymmetric information, which underpins the concepts of moral hazard and adverse selection, Professor Stiglitz's work focuses on income and wealth distribution, climate change, corporate governance, public policy, public finance, macroeconomics, and globalization. He's also the author of numerous best-selling books, and of course, his most recent book, The Road to Economic Freedom, Economics and the Good Society, which is the subject of this discussion tonight with Associate Professor Catherine James from the Melbourne Law School. Catherine is an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher, and she researches taxation law and policy with a focus on how technical questions of taxation impact on distributive justice. Catherine is the founder and convener of the Community Tax Project, an alliance between academia and the community and welfare sector to advocate for tax reform in support of social justice. Professor Stiglitz, it is a privilege for us to welcome you here tonight. You've created new fields of economics. Your work has changed the way that academics think and write and teach. But even more profoundly, it has changed the way the world is governed. You've tackled questions that philosophers and thinkers have asked throughout human history. What does a good society look like and how do we get it? You've addressed these questions against a backdrop of the economic theories and the attitudes that have led us here today. You challenge us to do better. And we're looking forward to overhearing this conversation and then participating with questions. Thank you.
Hi, Joe.
Hi.
Now, I'm going to start by saying I run a small outfit, which Jenny mentioned, called the Community Tax Project. And one of our aims is to increase awareness of the importance of tax to justice. And this may surprise you, but we generally don't have 400 people show up to our events. And of course, tax is usually perceived as technical or an unwanted intrusion into our lives. And so most people quite rightly tune out. But that, of course, suits others who stand to gain or lose from the system changing or remaining as it is. So I thought, since we've got this captive audience here, I'm going to start with a broad question, which is, can you speak a little bit to your vision of the good society and the role of taxation in working towards the good society and achieving justice?
Well, it is very difficult to define a good society. That's why I write so many books, uh, which I encourage you to read and maybe buy. Uh, but we know some things about what is not a good society. And we know that societies that are riven with the kinds of inequalities that we have, where those inequalities are getting greater, is not a good society. I can say a little bit from more firsthand experience looking at America, that a country where 73 million Americans voted for a person who is, I don't know what you say about Trump, uh, uh, you know, weird, to use the current language that the Democratic Party is using. I mean, I guess that's the softest word you could use. But that 73 million people voted for him, having experienced 4 years of his governing, that says something's wrong with that society. And it's important for us to try to understand the pathology. How did we wind up that way? And quite frankly, this book, The Road to Freedom, was in part motivated by the my fear of a return, and the view that one of the values that everybody pays some obeisance to is freedom. But that concept of freedom was uh, uh, stolen by the right without understanding what it meant. And we went through that experience very badly during the pandemic, where the freedom, the right emphasized the freedom not to wear masks. Wearing masks was an intrusion in their freedom. Getting vaccinated requirement was an intrusion. Social distancing was an intrusion in their freedom. But that meant that other people's freedom was lost. They gave the disease to people, some of whom lost their lives. And so you had this trade-off, and I guess we'll may talk about this later, but the freedom not to wear masks versus the freedom to live. And the right constantly looks at one side of that, but doesn't look at the other. And I would say a good society has to look at how we all cooperate together to build a better society. And when there are trade-offs, how do we discuss in a rational way how you make those trade-offs and which is more important? And in some cases there are difficult, but many of the cases are pretty easy. I mean, for me, it's pretty obvious that the freedom to carry an AK-47 is less important than the freedom to live. And in America today, we have a mass murder almost every day. And they're so common that now in almost every school, kindergartners, first grade kids have to prepare for what happens when somebody enters the classroom. Can you imagine what it does to the fear of the children, the fear of the parents, that they don't know whether their children are going to come home? So we have all these, we know some of the dimensions of what makes for a good society. And we know some aspects of a bad society. Let me just mention one more thing and talking about it. This very, very broad topic that we sometimes forget, and this is a real problem with standard economics. We assume that individuals enter the world fully formed. The technical term, we say that preferences are exogenous, that they're fixed. And yet we know, every parent knows, he spends all of their time trying to change the behavior of their children. We believe that we can make our children more honest, more cooperative, maybe even happier. But we believe we can shape in one way, not fully. It's not, it's not plasticine, but we can shape children, people. And this is the point, our economic systems play an important role in shaping us. That if we live in a society where, there are a lot of cooperatives, where people are encouraged to cooperate, you are going to wind up with individuals who are more cooperative. If your highest value and the only thing you're interested in is money, you wind up with people who focus on money. And you wind up with societies where people are likely to be more selfish, who are more likely to think it's a zero-sum game. And unfortunately, those are attributes that we wound up, I think, too much in the United States. So part of, when I think of what we mean by good society, it's both that we should be thinking about what is a good society, that it isn't, we know what is a bad society. We ought to be thinking about what are the things that we would like to create, and then what we do in our society move us in one direction or another.
Okay, so I did notice that you quite remarkably got a few laughs at the reference to exogenous preference formation. So we've clearly got a room full of a few economists here. So I might just drill down into the neoclassical component of neoliberalism, perhaps. And I think one thing that probably all share in admiring your work is that you contextualize the mathematical models that inform much of modern economics, and you bring in the social and historical and political context. You criticise neoclassical economics for downplaying market failures, and you write that markets on their own are essentially never efficient, and without regulation are prone to failures due to limited competition, imperfect information, exploitation and discrimination. But in the context of taxation, most of the tax reforms for the past 40 years have been justified on the basis of trying to preserve market efficiencies, so aiming for neutrality and not distorting market incentives, so favouring more so-called neutral taxes over more distortive taxes. And this has led to things like cuts to the corporate and personal income tax, the far heavier taxation of labour over capital income, and the rise of indirect consumption taxes like the value-added tax, or the goods and services tax, as we call it in Australia. So I'm just wondering if you can reflect on how your criticism of the faulty assumption of perfect markets or efficient markets, what that has to say about the trends in tax policy for the past 40 years.
Well, those trends are wrong. That's the 4-word answer. They're clearly misconceived, and for me, it's very sad because I began writing about the right way to think about it. One of my first papers on the corporate income tax you mentioned was in 1973. And in that paper, I explained that the corporate profits tax, the corporate income tax, is not a tax on capital, which is what most of the people who've been talking about tax cuts pretend it is. That it's really a tax mostly on pure profits, on monopoly profits. And that should be obvious because you deduct from your, when you pay the tax, you deduct not only the cost of labor, but you deduct the cost of capital. You deduct, either directly or indirectly through depreciation allowances or interest is deductible. It's no more a tax on capital than it's a tax on labor. You deduct labor costs, you deduct capital costs. So how could it be a tax on capital? And when and therefore I showed in that paper that it doesn't distort the level of investment. If anything, with accelerated depreciation, it can actually, raising the tax can actually encourage more investment. Sounds a little strange, but that's because you get more value in deduction than you're taxed at the other end. And we got evidence of that in the 2017 tax cut by Trump. One of the things I said in the paper, it does affect the nature of how you do finance, whether you finance it through debt or equity. So it does have some effects. I didn't, but so what I predicted when they had this massive cut of the corporate income tax in the United States from down to 21%, I predicted that it would not increase investment, and the evidence is it didn't increase. What it did do is lead to $1 trillion of share buybacks. That's a lot of money. And that money was money that could have, if it had been inside the corporate sector, could have led to more investment going forward. But it was, fed to individual share buybacks. Now, one of the things that people did learn from my paper, I explained in the paper this paradox that firms should not be paying dividends. The way they should distribute money from the corporate sector to the household sector should be by buying back shares. And that was particularly true at that particular era because capital gains tax were much lower than dividend taxes. And so when you buy back shares, you only have to pay a capital gains tax, and you only pay it on a small fraction because it's only the increase in the value of the shares, rather than when you write a dividend, you have to pay a tax on everything you receive. So it was so clear that the economy was not being rational, that, it wasn't possible at that point to identify the source of stupidity. Was it CEOs who didn't understand this? Or was it the investors who didn't understand it? But between these investors who didn't understand that paying dividends was stupid and CEOs who didn't understand it, it was clear somebody was getting it wrong and writing checks. Thank goodness they were writing checks. A lot of payments to the government in taxes that nobody rational should be paying. So that speaks to one of the points. It was so clear that the markets were not described well by the neoclassical model. And it's called the dividend paradox. And the big change that's occurred since then is that many firms, unfortunately, woke up to this stupidity. But I would talk to CEOs about this, and it became very clear they didn't understand what they were doing. So it gave me a lot of confidence in the corporate sector in America. But when I finally got it through their brains what was going on, they said, well, our investors won't understand it, so we're not going to change what we do. So but what has happened over that period of 50 years is that we went from a world in which almost all money went from the corporate to the household sector through dividends to a world where only about a third of the, so there's been a massive shift. I feel guilty about this, but a massive shift to share buybacks and other ways of lowering your tax, making it more rational. But it was so interesting when I went to seminars, I went MBR meetings, explained this fundamental irrationality in the market, which undermined the neoclassical model totally, undermined all the estimates of the corporate cost of capital. They said, well, they didn't know how to deal with it, and they just went on using their standard neoclassical model when this was so evident, so strong evidence that that model didn't make sense, and you couldn't reconcile what was going on with that model. And I developed a whole set of other paradoxes. One of the important paradoxes or conundrums is that if you had perfect capital markets, I wrote a paper showing that if you had perfect capital markets, nobody would be paying any capital taxation. That there were so many opportunities for what we call tax arbitrage. That is to say, as an example, and let me tell you, I don't know how many here billionaires you have in the audience. Most of my friends who are billionaires know about these tricks. They can't do them fully because markets are not perfect, but they can do them much better than you and I can do. So an example in the United States, and I think it's true in Australia, is that capital gains are not taxed until they're realized. And when you pass it on to your children, there's what is called a step-up basis. And so your children inherit the asset at the higher value, and the no taxes ever paid on that capital gain. Well, you don't have to postpone your consumption to wait until you die and pass it on to your children. You can get a derivative that allows you to, as if you sold it, you effectively sell it short, so you don't own it, but from the tax point of view, you do own it. So you have gotten rid of all the risk of ownership. You can get in a perfect market, you'd have all the opportunities to consume just as you would, and you would avoid paying capital gains taxes. And then I explain how you can convert other income to capital gains income. And so if markets were perfect, the tax authorities would not receive any tax income. Fortunately, markets are not perfect. And fortunately, most people don't understand how to do these tax arbitrage. But when you're a billionaire, you hire one of these very expensive tax lawyers, and they can't get you all the way, but they can get you a long way in reducing your taxes. And that's why in recent book by Zayas and Zuckman, they point out that the taxes paid by the richest Americans are at a lower rate than those paid by those at a lower, we don't have a progressive tax system. We have a regressive tax system. And, we have a few good people in our country where, like Warren Buffett, who says it's outrageous that he would be paying a lower tax rate than the secretary. And when he said that, he wasn't even talking about his unrealized capital gains. He was just saying he figured out, his tax lawyers have figured out how to pay lower taxes. But if he really looked at his his unrealized capital gain, his real tax rate was minuscule.
So on that theme, one of the things you call for in your book is for progressive taxation or a restoration of progressive taxation. And so you call for redistribution to finance high return public investments through progressive taxation. And so you've called for the restoration of high progressive marginal tax rates on high incomes. And as your comments have indicated, progressivity also goes to the base, so the types of things that we tax with capital income, wealth, and sometimes rent taxes playing a role in reaching the taxable capacity of the rich, whereas indirect consumption taxes and some forms of wage tax can place a heavier burden on the poor, who tend to spend all that they earn, including over a lifetime. And so I was wondering what you regard as the essential components of progressive taxation and what are the trade-offs that it will inevitably entail?
Yeah. So, let me break it down into, I don't like tax evasion. And I don't like tax avoidance. And we have a rhetoric where we say everybody believes in progressive taxation, but you look at what happens, it's not progressive. So when, in principle, everybody would agree that we ought to have at least some progressivity. And as I mentioned, in the US, we have a regressive, and I think most other countries, when you look at it in detail, are really regressive taxation. But let me, I don't think you can look at taxation apart from what you use the money for. And so let me just spend a minute on why I think it's so important that we have enough tax revenue to and more than we've been raising. You mentioned before this idea or I mentioned that in our society we have one person's freedom could be another person's unfreedom. That there are these trade-offs, but there are many important instances where if we work together collectively, we can all be better off. And the example I give of that is traffic lights. Traffic lights are regulation that takes away your freedom. You can't go until it's green. But in a fundamental sense, it increases freedom. And what do I mean by that? In a place like New York, if you didn't have traffic lights, nobody could move. You'd have gridlock. So having a simple rule on a restraint can increase everybody's freedom in a meaningful way. They can all move. And that's, freedom to do is really more important than that restraint of taking your turn, which is of secondary importance. Well, that's a metaphor for lots of things. So we've just been through a pandemic. We probably wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the vaccines. Vaccines were produced very rapidly. They were produced on the basis of an mRNA platform that was developed before the pandemic. And that was developed with government funds. So in the absence, so the point is collectively, we were able to get something that protected all of us. But to finance that, we had to have taxes. And those taxes are a restraint. They're taking away your freedom. But you ask, which is more important, that each of us pay a few dollars into by taxes or the freedom to live. And you can say, well, it's very clear. One gives us much more freedom. We've lost a little freedom in having to pay taxes, but as a society, we've clearly gained more freedom. And then you start thinking about a modern society. It's based on knowledge, innovation, health. All those things are basic research, are basically publicly provided. And so we become more dependent on collective action as we become more, urbanized, more of a knowledge-based, technology-based economy. So the irony is that the political discourse has been to try to make the stakes smaller, when the reality that we face is that we need larger, more cooperative action. And that means more taxation. And then, so to me, it's very clear. We need at least, more taxation than we've had. And the way the economy has been operating has created these great divides. And we have to think about how we reduce those divides. Partly, those divides are a result of, I would say, deficient rules of the game. Competition laws haven't kept up with changes in the economy. We finally, it took the US years and years to figure out that Google was a monopolist. We all knew Google was a monopolist, but it just earlier this week, on Monday, I think it was, US courts figured it out. They could have asked me a long time, but well, they did ask. It was a monopolist. It was so obvious. It was, it had market power, and there's so many other cases like that. So we have deficient rules that help create more inequality. We have rules that have squashed workers in the workplace and made it more difficult for them to work together collectively in unions. So the neoliberalism that you talked about before actually created rules that created more inequality. But as you have more inequality, if our society is to function, you have to have more taxes to try to redistribute it, so that give people the opportunity to have children, have nutrition, health. Just as an aside, and this is not, I know most of you are not American voters, but just to give you a sense of what one can do with a relatively little money. In 2021, when Biden first came into office, just the end of the pandemic, and we passed a pandemic recovery plan to get us, we didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. Biden said that it was important, as we recover from the pandemic, all this money being spent, let's think about how we can spend money to change our society, to make a better society. And he said, it is unconscionable that 20% of American children grow up in poverty. This is the richest country in the world. 20% of the children grow up in poverty. So he put provisions in that bill that would change that. In 1 year, the childhood poverty rate went down by 40 to 50% in 1 year. So, I mean, what that shows is that with a little more, just a little more tax revenue and a little bit more spending, we can actually make a big dent on some of our big social problems. But that's an example of, you want progressive taxation working with progressive expenditure policies to create, I think, a better society, and I think a better functioning society. I think the whole society works better, and in the sense that even those at the top can be better off because they don't have to worry so much about the societal dysfunction that we are seeing, for instance, in the form of Trump.
So your comment about COVID is reminiscent of the fact that we've just revealed how, of course, there's nothing natural about poverty. There's nothing natural about extremes in inequality. And COVID revealed, that if we spend a bit more, lo and behold, in Australia, we can have free and accessible childcare, for example. And inequality was reduced in many countries, including Australia, during that period. I just want to now turn this to a bit of a more philosophical discussion on the nature of private property rights and in political theory, because your book is as much a work in political theory as it is in economic theory. So you quote John Rawls, or you use John Rawls' theory of justice in working out how to make hard calls in reaching a good society. And the way you reconceptualize freedom is very reminiscent of Amartya Sen's work, looking at balancing capabilities or abilities to achieve freedom. Now, often debates on taxation focus very much on the costs of taxation, as you've said, and don't focus on the gains that are obtained through spending or revenue that the tax funds. And a lot of debates on taxation proceed from a presumption of inviolable private property rights and on the moral justness of market distributions, both of which you challenge in your book. So I was wondering if you can speak a bit more to these political insights and how they might be used to cut through in tax debates, which can tend to get quite technical.
Yeah, well, look, maybe I should begin with the remark that particularly the libertarians who have become a big force in U.S. politics, have some notion that the income that they have, they earned it, and therefore it's like theft for the government to take it away. So they begin with the presumption that whatever income they have, whatever wealth they have, they earned and is theirs by some moral right. Elon Musk is a recent, example of this kind of libertarian view. He doesn't mention the fact that he got $500 million from the U.S. government to keep Tesla going. And if the U.S. government hadn't lent Tesla that money, he would have lost, Tesla would have gone bankrupt, and he would not be in the position he is today. He's somehow forgotten that. That was history. And something like that is true by about many of the other people who've done very well. Take most of the tech billionaires. They wouldn't be where they were if the U.S. government had not created did the investment in creating the internet. It created the first browser. All these things that they depend on for their billions come from or are based on an infrastructure that U.S. government, that governments in the United States and other places paid for. Another example, the CEO of Pfizer, I've heard him, talk about, he somehow thinks that he deserves those billions of dollars from selling at very high prices the Pfizer vaccine and actually charging a higher price in South Africa than he charges in Europe because he can force them to do it. And he says, I didn't get a dime from the government. But the U.S. government and the German government and governments in other places did the research that he took advantage of. And did even not only the basic mRNA research, but even most of the work converting that into the COVID-19 vaccine. So how can you say I did it all myself? But that is the attitude that they take. So the point I make is that really property rights are a social construction, and people in law always recognize that, but people in the economics profession typically have forgotten that. It's a social construction. In the area of intellectual property, it's so apparent because different countries define it different ways, and we have big debates. And like any social construction, the issue should be, is it working for our social purpose? And in the case of COVID-19 during the pandemic, it didn't, because the way we define intellectual property rights deprived those in the developing countries and emerging markets of access to the vaccine. We wound up with vaccine apartheid. And that's had enormous political implications because they are resentful. We said Pfizer's profits were more important than your lives. That's what we said. And, obviously, if you say that, you're not making a lot of friends. At that moment, China and Russia were giving that vaccine. Inferior vaccines, yes, but at least they got them. And you've gotten onto one of my hot points. But they went, Pfizer went down to one of the Latin American countries and said, we'll give you the vaccine, but we're going to charge you a high price, and you have to keep the terms of the contract secret. And the government said, that's against our law. We have transparency in procurement laws. And, the United States told us to have those laws, even though US doesn't have them. But we were told we have to have them. World Bank comes out and beats you up if you don't have those laws. And they said, we don't care, break the law. And fortunately, Argentina at the time had a good government, doesn't have that now, but it had a good government at the time and said, I'm sorry, we won't, we're going to take the Russian vaccine and the Chinese vaccine. So that was an example. And in the case of South Africa, South Africa did a secret agreement. But fortunately, South Africa had a Freedom of Information Act. And an NGO in South Africa said, we want to see that procurement agreement. And then they found out why they didn't want it to be open, because they were charging a higher price than in Europe. And 80% of the vaccines that were produced in South Africa had to be shipped to Europe when they were desperate for them. So anyway, I'm just giving you a picture of something that characteristics of not a good society, and the way profits are made that aren't morally justified. And, the libertarian view is just not right. There was a very powerful book that came out just a year ago by Amitav Ghosh, who's a beautiful writer, and it's called Smoke and Ashes. And what he describes is how so much of the wealth in Europe and America derived from what was called the China trade. But the China trade sounds perfectly nice, and that's what we were taught. Low library at Columbia University, he became wealthy from the China trade. Well, what Amitav Ghosh explains what the China trade was. It was the opium trade. And most of you probably know that Europe, with the support of the United States, went to war to force China to be open to opium. The principle of free trade meant you had that was so important that it was a violation of a basic human right, they thought, in Europe, that China did not want to have opium. And so we insisted that they have opium. It turns out for you, it's a wonderful book to read, but it highlights that it was the way that Britain responded to the balance of payments problem. So those of you who are trade economists, the opium trade is part of the way we wanted a lot of goods from China, like China, porcelain, and other things from China. China didn't want anything from the West. And so we thought, what can we sell China? And opium is a fantastic product. There's some of you are business students, you get repeat sales, over and over again. There's not much of a better product. And demand elasticity is very low. So it was a very profitable, and it did rectify the imbalance in the balance of payments. So I don't know if it has lessons for us today, but the point I want to make is that a lot of the wealth in a place like the United States comes from slavery, from displacing indigenous people, from narcotics trade, is what we would call it today. How can you call that having moral value of your wealth?
And when you make the point that the slave owners, not the slaves, were compensated too.
Yeah, that was one of the striking things. I mean, at the end of slavery, say in the UK, they said, "Oh, we have to compensate." Now, as we look at it from our current perspective, you say, "Oh, who are you going to compensate? People who've been working their whole lives and have gotten no wages, no compensation for that work. They were slaves. That's who we say should be compensated." No, that's not how capitalism worked. The people who were compensated were the slave owners. And the magnitude of the compensation of the slave owners in the UK was a significant fraction of the national debt. It was an enormous amount that was given to the slave owners who stolen the labor of the workers.
And I think only fully repaid in 2017 or 2018,
Something like that,
quite
exactly, yeah.
recently. Yeah. Because you've referenced international dimensions, I might look more globally now, because your book, you quote Isaiah Berlin in your book to say, who says that freedom for the wolves has come at death to the sheep. And you identify how this pattern occurs globally with gross inequality and freedoms between nations. And you, of course, once served as chief economist of the World Bank, but have also been critical of the Washington Consensus, which I think in the context of taxation has often denied developing countries the sometimes simpler and fairer taxes that Western countries used at a similar level of development. These countries have also surrendered much of their sovereign taxing rights to rich countries through tax treaties. And estimates suggest that they lose far more in tax arbitrage or tax evasion or minimisation than they receive in foreign aid. So given the desperate need of funds in these countries, but the few resources they have to devote to the task and the way the rules are stacked against them, what do you see as a way forward towards achieving greater justice at that international level?
Yeah. That's a great question. One of the things that I'm engaged in right now is I'm co-chair of something called the Independent Commission on Reform of the International Tax system. It's called ICRIC. It's a terrible name. And obviously we needed a better PR person to think of a better name, but there we have it. But has been concerned with precisely the question of how does our multinational tax system work? And one aspect of globalization that was very clear to me from the very beginning is that people talk about all the benefits of globalization, trade and capital movements. But one of the other aspects of it is it gives enormous opportunities for tax avoidance and evasion. And those were brought home very forcefully in the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. There's a very good movie, I forget the title of it, but with Meryl Streep, based on the Panama Papers. And it created an opportunity for firms to move money from one country to another in ways to move it from high tax jurisdictions to low tax jurisdictions, in a way that has enabled these rich corporations to basically reduce their tax liability to a very small amount. Example of that was Apple claimed that all of its profits in Europe were a result of the economic activities of 320 some people in Ireland. It had, Apple was doing very well, and just a small number of people in Ireland seemed to be the origin of all the billions of dollars of profits. These are really wonderful people that they have in Ireland. And then, so the point is Ireland has very low taxes. But then to show you how this international system of tax evasion avoidance occurs, they have a little clause in the Irish tax system, which says that if you have an Irish company that is largely controlled from outside of Ireland, you don't have to pay taxes in Ireland. And they said, in Ireland, oh, it's controlled from Silicon Valley. So they only had to pay, less than, I think, 0.2% or 0.02% tax on their income. And then when the EU said, oh, no, you have to pay us a little bit more, they said, we'll move to the Channel Islands, which is an even worse tax haven than Ireland. So the point is that globalization now has opened up this vast opportunity. Interestingly, after the 2008 crisis, many of the advanced countries said, this is really absurd. We're losing money. But they weren't concerned with the issue that you raised. They weren't concerned with developing countries and emerging markets losing tax revenue. They were concerned with their losing tax revenue. So they had a discussion at the OECD, which is the think tank of the advanced countries, and they came up with a proposal called BEPS, Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, that was supposed to address this problem. And then it took them a long time to come up with a proposal. And they came up with an interesting proposal, two parts of it. One part was a global minimum tax. Our group, ICRIC, said that it should be 25%. They came up with 15%. And then they had a loophole so that it was actually 12.5% or 13%. When most developing countries, like the average in Latin America is about 28%, 25%. So what they were trying to do is to set a standard that would force all the countries to lower the taxes. So an exercise that began as one of raising the taxes wound up as one that risked lowering taxes. So that was one part of it. The other part was a question of, if you're going to tax, who gets the right to tax? Like it's called allocating the tax rights. And we took this simple view that you ought to tax where the profits originate. If you're exporting natural resources, the profits belong to the generated by the natural resources. The natural resource country should get all the, something Australia ought to remember. Because you're giving away lots and lots of money to rich corporations. I know they need it, but you need it more. So our principle was, you know, and if you have production going on in Bangladesh, Bangladesh ought to get the profits, not being booked to somewhere else. So that was our principle. They said, we'll only reallocate a very small fraction of a concept they called residual profits, which they made out of nowhere. So they were going to reallocate only a small fraction. And then when they allocated, it would be based not on where production occurred, but on where sales occurred. Where do sales occur? In the rich countries. So it was a redistribution to the rich countries. Not a surprise, because it was done by the OECD, by the club of the advanced countries. They invited the developing and emerging countries got so annoyed, they said, we want a seat at the table. And they all got invited in, but they turned all the microphones off. And so, I'm joking, but they might as well have turned off the microphones, because every proposal that came from the developing countries and emerging markets was totally ignored. And now what has happened, and this is the OECD has failed because in order for that first pillar to go into effect, enough countries had to sign, and among the US had to agree. And the US is not going to agree. They made it very clear that they won't sign in. And they won't agree because the Republicans think that any agreement is a giving up their sovereignty, and that American ingenuity is the only reason that anybody in the world is prospering. And the Democrats think that the agreement is totally unfair to developing countries and emerging markets. So both the left and the right have agreed that this is a bad agreement. And so after 10 years of negotiation, we have nothing. So right now, this is going on too long about but finally, the developing countries and emerging markets got angry of what the foot dragging that was going on. And the African Union made a motion at the UN to move the discussions into the UN and have an international convention about global taxation. And unfortunately, the developed countries said, we don't want fair taxation globally. And the US, I mean, under Biden, took an active role, twisting arms around the world to vote against it, but they failed. And you know, we view this as partly a victory of ICRIT, that we were campaigning for this for years, for a UN discussion, and it was passed overwhelmingly with even one European country, a couple of European countries abstaining. So there is this discussion now going on at the UN, and I'm hopeful that at least something will come out of that.
So I think I've probably got time for one more question. So I'm going to try and merge a couple into one, which is that I think you write in your book that one of the aims of your book is to make economics a more cognitive, capacious exercise, or cognitively capacious exercise. And your work reminds me of economists working at the start of the 20th century, who, when faced with quite similar challenges to today, spoke of the need to address inequality. And of course, part of that solution was through progressive taxation and obviously the development of the welfare state. And we achieved, you note in your book that we achieved something in those rich countries which haven't been achieved before or since, which is that we increased economic growth and reduced inequality. And I wanted to know what your reflections are on what we can learn from that period, in addition to, you know, all that's happened in economic sense in the part you mentioned, behavior, the trends, the advances in behavioral economics, but what we can learn from that period and the subsequent periods since in order to progress closer towards your idea of the good society, or progressive capitalism, as you call it.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of important things, and one needs to see that period in contrast to the last 40 years. You know, neoliberalism was supposed to expand freedom, and that expansion of freedom was supposed to increase growth, and then trickle-down economics was supposed to assure that the benefits of that growth would go to everybody. Okay, so that was basic idea. What was the outcome? Growth was slowed by about 40%. You know, it's hard to believe the irony. A set of policies that were sold on the basis they were going to lead to more growth actually led to 40% reduction in growth. And what growth occurred went to the top. So we got more inequality. And we had had a long period where we hadn't had any economic crisis. And globally, after we went into the neoliberal era, we had crisis after crisis after crisis, including the global financial crisis of 2008. So that asks the question, what was good, you know, what was good about the earlier era and what was bad about the neoliberal era? Well, analytically, I mean, what I spent most of my early years of my academic career is to try to understand what was wrong with all those arguments of Friedman and Hayek. They said, let free markets rip and that would be efficient. And, you know, when I read Milton Friedman, it was just a lot of garbage words. You know, there were, and I talk about in my book some of my encounters. I got to know Milton Friedman fairly well. I spent a number of years at the Hoover Institution. This is how would you describe it? It's the think tank of the right wing. And I was the token liberal there. They wanted to know what a liberal thought, or, you know, a liberal not in your sense, but in an American sense. And I wanted to know what these crazy people on the right thought. So I thought, if I'm going to explain what's wrong with them, I better get to know them pretty well. So I describe in the book one of the seminars I gave. I think it was back in actually 1969 at University of Chicago, and I proved in there that maximizing shareholder value did not lead to societal well-being. And so it was a theorem. And he didn't like that result because a little bit later, he wrote an article in the New York Times advocating shareholder value maximization. So I'd already proven that he was wrong before he wrote his article, but he didn't pay any attention to me. And at the end, after the seminar, he said, "Joe, you're wrong." I said, "Well, no." Where did I put the hat, the rabbit in the hat? What assumption did I make that you disagree with? Or where did I make a mistake in my mathematics? I was a little bit of a brazen young person at that point. I was, I think I was about 24, 25. But anyway, he said, "Joe, you're wrong." And we went back and forth. I said, "Well, tell me where I'm wrong. I don't want to make mistakes." He said, "You're wrong." Yeah.
Hmm.
So that helped motivate me to. Well, I learned one lesson from that, from what happened after that. Publishing in the Quarterly Journal of Economics or the Journal of Finance is not as influential as publishing in the New York Times Magazine. So for those of you who want to change the world, probably go to the New York Times Magazine. But the second thing, this is ideology. It was politics. He was not an economist at that point. He was trying to advocate for a particular set of arrangements, political arrangements that would advance certain interests. And he went on and said in his book Capitalism Freedom that capitalism is important for enriching the material resources we have, but it's even more important for political freedom. But then you look at what he did, he didn't care about political freedom. He went down and was a major supporter of Pinochet and used Pinochet's dictatorship to implement some of his crazy ideas. And which cost Chile a great deal. So I think another lesson that you learn from that, besides where you should publish your papers, another lesson is that economics and politics are really intertwined, and that too often we don't step aside and try to look dispassionately at what we're saying. And that was what I tried to do with my research, is say, what makes for a good economic system? And what will free markets lead to economic efficiency? That's a question you can answer quite apart from your politics. And that's where the market failure came in, recognition that whenever information is imperfect and asymmetric, markets are incomplete, which is always, then Adam Smith's invisible hand, that pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society, is not correct. And the way I put it, sometimes forcefully, is the reason the invisible hand is invisible is that it's not there. And so once you recognize it's not there, then we have the question, the question that goes back to the Enlightenment, how do we organize our society in ways that succeeds in getting towards a better society, a good society, or even economic efficiency, even in a very narrow sense. And we can, I think at this point, we can say we've delineated clearly what kinds of interventions in the market and what kinds of social arrangements or economic arrangements, because I think too much emphasis is put on the market. So quite often markets are not the right way to begin, but different kinds of social organizations and can lead to better outcomes. And then the harder question is, what are the political organizations that lead to our ability to cooperate together to get those better economic and social arrangements?
And I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that we want to take some questions from the audience, but you have a great, so Miranda, do you want to come up and you can start giving Joe a couple of questions? But you have a great quote in your book that the economy is supposed to serve society and not the other way around. And so that question of the importance of the political arrangements that's needed to better serve society is a real key one. I'll hand over to Miranda now. He's got probably 1,000 questions from you guys to ask, and we'll probably get to ask about 2 or 3. But I'll hand over to Miranda for some questions from the audience.
Thanks a lot. And thanks so much, Joe, Professor Stiglitz, for a wonderful talk. I think actually you have answered some of the questions. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm really only going to be able to highlight a few, but what I thought I would do is maybe try to put sort of 2 or 3 together. We've got some common themes that might drill a bit more into some aspects of what you've said in response to Catherine's really careful, thoughtful analysis. So one question that has come up in a couple of different ways in the questions that have come through, and well done on the technology. One question is this issue of other forms of social organization. So obviously, I mean, tax systems and the state do, in a sense, depend on the market. We have this market economy relationship, I suppose. But some of the questions that I've seen in the list relate to how important is the state? How do we think about the state? And what about perhaps other forms of social organization? Someone raised the possibility of churches or religious organizations or civil society organizations. Do you have a comment about sort of that centrality of the state, which we see in sort of tax and regulation of the market, compared to other forms of social organization?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. What I argue, both in this book and my previous book on People, Power, and Profits, which is about more focused explicitly on progressive capitalism, is that a successful economy needs an ecology of institutional arrangements. That there are some areas where markets are private for-profit enterprises are really important. You know, probably making steel. If you have good regulation, good competition policy, pollution regulation, good labor relations, you know, you have embedded in a regulatory environment, and the government is responsible for that regulatory environment. But within that, you can, these are really important parts of the institutional framework. And that's why I use the term progressive capitalism to remind us that that's part of the story. But we're increasingly moving into what's sometimes called the care economy and the service economy, where it's education, aged, healthcare. In many of these areas, you don't want somebody thinking about how they can extract the most profits.
So you have a not-for-profit type structure.
You need a not-for-profit. And the reason is very clear. One of the essential aspects of the way the market works when it works is that the consumers can monitor what is being bought. But if you have somebody with dementia in an old age home, they aren't monitoring how they're being cared for. and relying on somebody who's asking his question, how can I make more money off of a dementia person, is not a healthy society, you know, and you don't want that. You don't, you know, and when I saw the hedge funds move into the old age care, I got worried in the United States. And that's the same thing, you know, with Sweden, a lot of discussions in the pandemic in Sweden, Sweden didn't perform well. It didn't perform well because the old age homes have been privatized and their incentives were such as to leave people more exposed than they would have been, partly because of the labor that they were hiring and bringing in to the old age homes.
And we do have some of that privatized aged care here in Australia
Yeah.
as well.
So I think you have to, you know, and then I mentioned before in my talk, the role of co-ops, and co-ops play an important part in our society. The most important, an important part of our financial system is our co-ops. We call them credit unions. And the credit unions were the only part of our financial system that did not behave badly before 2008. And were the only part of our financial system after, in the years immediately after 2008, who kept up a flow of credit to small businesses.
So if we can just extend this, we mentioned not-for-profits. So again, some of the questions are about philanthropy. And so this also takes us back to what are we going to do about the billionaires type questions. So, you know, we have these big philanthropy capitalists, sort of big Gates Foundation, these big donation foundations. And then on the other hand, we're struggling to tax the billionaires. So do you have any comments about that relationship between what is usually tax deductible philanthropy, of course, relative to using a tax mechanism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, my view is, given that they've walked off with so much money, it's better that they give it back. So I'm all in favor of people like Gates giving back his money. But the fundamental question of, there are two points here. You know, the fundamental question of the decisions about what kind of society we have should be collectively decided and not delegated to a foundation. You know, that they have taken on a very important, their voice is very strong. The Gates Foundation has been very good in getting healthcare to developing countries and emerging markets. But there are a lot of disagreements about the best way of doing that. And should you let one person make those critical decisions? Let me just give you one example, and one that I found quite interesting. The patent system, I think, we've mentioned it, has a lot of problems with it. And there are better ways of incentivizing R&D. One of them is, that I've written about, is called the prize system. You give a prize. A patent is a prize, but the patent is you know, the first person to get the idea gets a prize. The prize is monopoly, and monopoly distorts markets. And so you would have thought any economist would say it's better to give a money prize, give them some money, and then use markets to get the price low so everybody could benefit. And the price system has been used for a very long time. It was used in 19th century England when they had a lot of problems with chimney flues, and they caught on fire, and they put little kids to go down the chimney to clean the chimney. It wasn't very good for the children. As you can imagine, they died. So somebody said, I'll give a prize for a mechanical chimney flue. And the guy who gave giving the prize, the idea was, I want to make sure that not just the rich people have chimney flues, you know, but the poor people, that everybody, no child should be used as doing this. Chimney sweep is what they used to call it. So we have a better system. Bernie Sanders introduced legislation in the Senate to try to push this idea. But, and so I talked to the Gates Foundation about it, and they weren't interested. Why? Well, intellectual property is part of their mentality. So I thought, here's this irony. All of the money that comes from the abuse of intellectual property in technology is being transferred to an abuse of intellectual property in pharmaceuticals. But you could have gotten so much more leverage if they had created a more competitive market in pharmaceuticals.
So maybe time for a couple more before our closing. So I'm going to, we're here in a university. Some of the questions have been about the role of education. You talk about the learning society in the book. Are there some things about the way that we currently manage our liberal or less liberal education? And a related but more specific question, I'm sure there's some in the room who'd really like the answer to this. What should young scholars or academics or researchers or economists be researching now? What is the thing that's what do you see as the really interesting areas? So the systemic one and the specific one.
Yeah, those are, both very hard questions. I think in terms of in terms of my own research strategy, and then maybe that's give it a little hint. I think that, I entered economics because I was really concerned about inequality. I had planned to be a physicist and solve, the deep problems of the world. But I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which is a city with a lot of inequality, racial discrimination, labor strife, and it was the golden age of capitalism. I didn't realize that things were so great then. So I had the idea that, here's a rich society, we should be able to do better. So it was that big question that sort of motivated me. And that motivated me to move from physics into economics. And then when I got into economics, I was lucky. I went to MIT. If I had wound up in Chicago, I just wondered what I would be like. And that could have happened. It could have happened. I had some discussion with my, professors where I should go. But the peculiar thing about MIT at the time was that they hated Milton Friedman. They hated Chicago through school. They were good, you'd say, centrist Democrats. But the models they were using were models in which markets seemed to work perfectly. And I couldn't get, and you had microeconomics about perfect markets and macroeconomics about terrible markets and, deep depressions and so on. And then you had Paul Samuelson saying, oh, there's this neoclassical synthesis that the economy is perfect except when it's not. And I said that I couldn't wrap my head around that idea as a premise for the systemic.
So find a passion and a paradox.
Maybe that's the right, yeah. And look for the assumptions that are not listed under the assumptions. So, you read, I read, read DeBrue's book, Theory of Value, and, it was the book that laid out the theorems about markets being efficient, okay? And the first and second fundamental theorems of welfare economics. And you go through you know, all kinds of assumptions, continuity, upper semi-continuity, or any mathematical, it was all there. Except there was no assumption listed about perfect information, homogeneous commodities, or any of the things that made this relevant for applying to the real world. And so that's what motivated me. I said, you know, there's something missing here, and it's something that should have been obvious, but was so obvious that it was there. It was the elephant in the room, as I say. But often you don't see that elephant in the room, and look for that elephant in the room.
Look for the elephant. I'm very conscious of our time and so many wonderful questions, including we didn't really get to more questions about the international context and the role of developing countries. That movie, by the way, with Meryl Streep is called The Laundromat.
That's right. That's
thank you,
right.
Ruth.
Thank
I
you.
would also want to say that it's delightful that there is another room full of people here in Melbourne watching another tax movie, in which I
Right.
believe you feature even.
That's right.
Tax Wars with Oxfam. So if you get a chance to see that, you should. But I promise I'll forward all the questions to the professor, and I'm sure they'll inspire him. I hope you enjoyed thinking them up as you're listening to the lecture. I'll pass back. Thank you. What to say of you?
Just before Alison formally closes, I just want to say a few words of thanks. I think the modern neoliberal university often forgets that it's people, not profits, that matter. And so I want to thank the people that mattered tonight. First and foremost, Avril Gaylor, who's been my right-hand woman in organising tonight's event, as well as many others who I won't mention. Thanks to Professors Alison Duxbury, Jenny George, Paul Kaufman and Miranda Stewart for supporting tonight's event, and to the Melbourne Social Equity Institute for supporting tonight and the Community Tax Project more generally. Thanks to Richard Dennis and the team at the Australia Institute, including DQuinn, firstly for getting Joe out here, and secondly for lending us Joe for the evening, because it's been terrific. And finally to Joe and his team, including your wife, Anya, who I know you credit with helping you spread your message to a wider audience. This event came about because about a year ago, I asked Joe if he'd speak at a conference on tax and justice we had intended to run, which we've now pushed back till April next year. And Joe and his team, to their credit, kept in contact and honoured their commitment. And it's been such a boost for us to give prominence to this topic, which I hope you'll agree is of great importance. And so if this has piqued your interest, then please do get in touch. But also on a personal level, like what a treat for me to get to talk about two of my favourite topics with one of my intellectual heroes in front of 400 of my closest friends. So Joe, thank you very much for that. We've got a couple of gifts, which I'll give you afterwards.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I did think that those words of passion and paradox were a good place to end. So thanks for that, Miranda. My name is Alison Duxbury and I'm the Interim Dean of Melbourne Law School, and it is my pleasure to formally thank Professor Stiglitz for his time this evening. It is an honour and a pleasure to have you at the University of Melbourne during your stay in Melbourne. And your conversation tonight with my law school colleague, Catherine James, has been full of insight and, of course, Catherine's favourite things, which I now know are tax and justice. So in the preface to your book, you write, "We must also ask what a good society is and figure out how to get there." In your book, you hope that your work contributes to a deeper understanding of the meaning of freedom and strengthens the democratic debate over what kind of economic, political and society system will contribute to the freedom of most citizens. And tonight, you have contributed to our understanding of all of those concepts in a much greater depth. Reimagining what is possible in a good society through tax design remains an integral part of what should be a constant conversation in Australia and across the world. Both Catherine and Miranda are members of the Community Tax Project, a key interdisciplinary research initiative at the University of Melbourne. And it partners with community organisations and researchers from across the university, tax design as a tool for social justice is vital, and I commend my colleagues, Catherine and Miranda, along with their fellow researchers for their contribution to this aim. Professor Stiglitz, with so many people here this evening, it remains clear that there is a great appetite for continued discussion of the values and solutions you've spoken about this evening and across your distinguished career. In this university, I believe we have enormous capacity and responsibility for pursuing advances in social justice and the reduction of economic and social inequality. Events like this one are a significant part of that greater responsibility. Thank you to Catherine and Miranda for your conversation this evening and all the work you have done. Thank you also to the Faculty of Business and Economics and also the professional staff of the Office of Research. Catherine has already mentioned APRIL, but there were a number of others who contributed to this event tonight. So thank you on behalf of the Law School. So this concludes our scheduled proceedings. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you for your questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.